All right, so far we've gone through 4 functions of mathematics. What are the 4 functions of mathematics? Adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing when it comes to our fractions. And then we once again did another review. Why did we do a review? Because we got a test coming up and I need you to get these steps inside of your head. We got to practice, 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 and every practice problem we do, we build that muscle memory. Some of you are switching your steps around. You get into multiplication, you want to get a common denominator and keep it. Well, one of the things we can do is by making sure that we're practicing problems to do them correctly. And if I'm really struggling to figure out those steps, having that paper out in front of me that reminds me what my steps are. Once again, I've mentioned it on several videos now. Remember, the top of it says addition of fractions in all my steps, and then subtraction of fractions in all my steps, multiplication with what I do with a whole number, what I do with a mixed number, and then on the back was all the division. So one of the things I'm going to do, I've already said, I already made extra copies, they're all gone. I'm not going to continue to waste paper, but I do have a digital copy for you as of today on Canvas underneath announcements when it comes to your math course. So if you go back to the math where the video was started and you go into the announcements section, you're going to see 4 math functions with fractions, and that form is there for you. You can download it, you can save it into your own OneDrive in a math folder, so you always have it just in case you need it. Going through and making sure we're following along and paying attention, that's key, right? So guess what I'm going to say? Guess what image is going to be on my board? It's been on most of them, right? Make sure you are following along. Make sure you're listening. Make sure you're building that muscle memory. We practice, practice, practice so that our body remembers what it is we're doing mathematically. Following along, once again, does not mean to wait until I'm done working the problem, you duplicate it on your worksheet, and then you don't know what to do. That doesn't help you learn it. It's following along step by step. I have some of you that you have a high A in my math class because you do this every single time. And you challenge yourself to make sure that you are. You're going to be successful. And I have a couple of you that are struggling that you're really not listening to me, you're really not following along, and then you pause the video and you see that I have something written down, and then you just try to duplicate it. But you don't understand what I'm doing because your brain's not engaged with me. You're going to become a better math student if you follow along and you get this the first time, and then instead of having to come and ask, it's going to help you because you're going to get your work done here at school. All right, so here we go. We have a division problem. The focus problem here is a box weighing 2 1/3 pounds contains robot kits weighing 1 1/6 pounds apiece. How many robot kits are in the box? Now tomorrow's lesson is all story problems. The key to any story problem with division is making sure that I know what amount the things are coming from. Okay? So if I can start with knowing the amount that I have, the amount that's being used, the length that I'm dividing from, these become a lot easier. If I can read it and realize that this box weighs 9 1/3 pounds, and then I'm going to put it in equal groups of 1 1/6, then I know I can set it up successfully. Notice they've already set it up successfully for you. So as we go through these, we have to start by realizing I can't have mixed numbers in a division problem, so I have to change them into improper fractions. A couple of you are not remembering how to do that, but then when I ask you to show me how you did it on the practice papers with the video, you haven't done it. Excuse me. So make sure you're following along and we learn these steps. These steps, doing functions with fractions, is going to be used all year long. So it's important we know what we're doing. So I have 9 1/3, which I know I have to change it to an improper fraction. So I start at the bottom, I multiply and add, always going clockwise. Once again, clockwise, when I look at a clock and follow the second hand, it goes this way, right? Starting to the right, down and up. So I have to start at the bottom and go clockwise. I'm going to go 3 times 7. 3 times 7 gives, or excuse me, 3 times 9 gives me 27. That's where my 7 came from. And then I'm going to add. So I multiply, then I add. That gives me my new numerator. So I have 28. I always keep my denominator. Always is going to stay the same. So my 3 is going to stay there. That's going to be my first improper fraction. Then I insert where the original problem is. Now, if you want to write it on top like I did, that's fine. If you want to start in this work area, I realize my work area looks different than yours because I'm just going to go through and work these problems and set them up. We're not going to estimate. I'm going to take all that extra space and those extra lines out and just have a nice clean work area. If you'd like, get some notebook paper and work it on there. That's fine with me. My second one then is 1 and 1/16, and I know I can't use that one. So I'm going to take my 1 and 1/16. I'm going to start at the bottom once again, clockwise, multiply and add. 6 times 1 is 6. Adding my 1 is 7. I'm going to keep my denominator. So that goes into my second one. Now I already started those a little early, so I must have had my animations out of order, so I apologize. But reviewing my steps to division of fractions, the first step is I can't do it. So I know I have to change it into a math problem that I can do. So I know I'm going to keep my first one, so I have my arrow in my first fraction. Second step is to change division to multiplication. That was division up there. Now I have my multiplication sign. And then we got to do the reciprocal thing, right? Flip my second fraction. So I'm going to take my second fraction of 7/6, and I'm simply going to turn it upside down. So once I flip it, now I have a multiplication problem of fractions, which I can do. Multiplication of fractions can get into really large numbers if I don't cross-reduce when I can. I always cross-reduce when I can. Some of you don't like to, and I get that, but some of you are getting into really big numbers, like the high hundreds and even the thousands, because you're multiplying just straight across and getting those really big numbers. There's nothing wrong with that as long as you convert and reduce correctly with those really big numbers. I like small numbers because I'm kind of like Pooh. I've got a very little brain. Okay? So I'm going to see what I can cross-reduce between the two. I have a 3 and a 6. I know that 3 is a factor of both numbers. So that means I'm going to divide. That's what factors mean, right? The numbers that we'll divide into evenly. So I'm going to divide each of those by 3, and 3 goes into 3 one time, where 3 goes into 6 2 times. Then I look at 7 and 28. So that kind of goes along with the idea of weeks. If I learn my multiplication of facts the way my 5th grade teacher, Mr. Day, taught me to do my multiplication of 7s, is just think about weeks. In 1 week I have 7 days. In 2 weeks I have 14 days. In 3 weeks I have 21 days. And in 4 weeks I have 28 days. So I know 7 will go into 28 evenly. When I reduce by 7s then, I have 7 goes into 7 once and 7 goes into 28 4 times. Now I'm left with smaller numbers, and multiplication of fractions, and multiplication of fractions tells me to multiply straight across. So I always draw my arrows, and some of you are getting confused what your numbers are. So if you do the crossing out when you're reducing, it'll eliminate some of the numbers you're choosing from. But if I actually connect my arrows to the numbers that I'm left with, so I have my 4 times my 2, and I have my 1 times my 1. That gives me a nice clear fraction of 8/1. It is top heavy, it's improper, I can't use it, so I can only use in my answers, not my work. In my answers is where I have to have whole numbers or to convert into a nice whole number with a mixed number. Improper fractions can't work on my answers, but they do work to get my math done. Had a couple of people confused yesterday, so I wanted to emphasize that. So now I have 8 left over. It is a story problem, so I have to have a label with my answer. So I'd have to answer as 8 kids. All right, so now they just throw these out there. They say, well, we got to do some changing, right? We got to follow our steps because they can't divide. So if I have 2 1/3 divided by 1/6, I know I have to change my 2 1/3 quickly into an improper fraction before I do any of these steps, because it'll mess me up if I try to do anything else with it. I know I'm going to take my 2 1/3. I'm going to do that clockwise thing. I'm going to start at the bottom, multiply and add. 3 times 2 gives me my 6, and 6 plus my 1 is a 7. So I'm going to have a numerator of 7, and then I keep my original denominator. Now I have 7/3, and now I can plug it in and follow my steps for division. I have 7/3. I know I have to keep my first one. I know my division is going to become multiplication, and then I'm going to flip my second fraction. I'm going to use its reciprocal. So I have 6 over 1. Now, I have multiplication of fractions, which is the easiest math work to do with fractions, but I'm going to cross-reduce if I can. 7 and 1 will not cross-reduce. 1 is a prime number, so is 7, and 1 won't change if I reduce by 1s. So there's no point to that. But it can reduce by 3s because it is a factor of 3 and 6. 3 goes into 3 one time, and 3 goes into 6 2 times. When I multiply across then, I end up with 7 times 2, which is 14, and 1 times 1, which is 1. Improper fraction, right? It's top heavy, so I just make it a whole number since 1 is in my denominator. It just becomes 14. When I look at B then, I start out once again with a mixed number, and I know I have to change it into an improper fraction to do the math. So I'm going to do my clockwise, starting at the bottom. 4 times 5 is 20, and then I add 20 plus 3 gives me my 23, keeping the denominator of 4. So 23/4 is the fraction I have to use in my math problem. So I plug it in as 23/4. I know that I then follow my steps for division. I cannot divide, so I'm going to keep my first one, so I bring it down. My division will become multiplication. And then my second one, my 3/8, I'm going to flip it into its reciprocal. I'm going to turn it upside down and have 8/3. I check to see if I can cross reduce. Well, I can. I have my 4 and my 8. 3 and 23 won't. 3 is a prime number, but it will not go into 23 evenly. So I take my 4. I could reduce by 2, but then I'd have to reduce by 2 again if I want to get it into its lowest form. 4 is the greatest common factor between 4 and 8. So if I reduce by 4, it does make my work a lot easier. 4 goes into 4 one time, and 4 goes into 8 2 times, and then I'm left with just multiplying across. 23 times 2 is going to give me 46, and 1 times 3 is 3. But there is where I can't have my improper fraction. I can't be top heavy. So what do I do with a fraction when it's top heavy? Hopefully you thought, or maybe you've already started on it, but that's my division problem. And when I start it, my top number is always my dividend. The top goes inside, the bottom is on the outside because it is my divisor. I ask how many times 3 will go into 46 evenly. Well, some of you, I'm aware, you already know your multiples of 15. Most people don't know multiples of 15. But 3 goes into 4 one time with 1 left over, and then that's 3 going into 16, and it only goes into 5 times because that would be 15. And 3 times 15 is indeed 45. So when I subtract those, I have 1 as my remainder. Remember how to build that fraction as my remainder. My remainder is always my numerator. It goes on top. And then my divisor, the one on the outside, is always my denominator. So it goes on bottom. So I'm simply left with, when I started with 46/3, with 15 and 1/3. That's a mixed number that I can have in my answer. All right, so in this story problem, it says 4 hikers shared 3 1/3 quarts of water equally. How much did each hiker receive? Once again, if I know that I have to start with the amount that's there, the amount that I'm going to use, the amount that I'm going to break apart, then I know how to set them up correctly. Because if I switch them, I end up with a completely different answer, which is therefore a completely wrong answer. So I know I have 3 1/3 quarts of water, and I'm going to divide it amongst 4 people, and that is the way that they set it up for us. And once again, I cannot use that mixed number in my math problem, so I have to change 3 1/3. 3 1/3, I start at the bottom, I multiply and add, going clockwise. 3 times 3 is going to give me my 9, and then 9 plus 1 gives me my new numerator of 10. Keeping my denominator of 3 then, I have 10/3, which I plug in back into the first position of my division problem, and then I go through my steps. I know I can't divide, so I'm going to bring down my first one. I'm going to change division into multiplication, and then my second one, I'm going to flip. Oh, wait a minute, that's a whole number. Can't flip a whole number, right? Has to be a fraction. So I'm going to start with making sure that I have 4 over 1. I always put my whole numbers over 1. That gives me something that I can flip upside down. I can get a reciprocal of 1/4. Multiplication then, I see if I can cross reduce, I have 1 and 3, both prime numbers, and reducing by 1, once again, dividing by 1 doesn't change the number at all. 4 and 8 though, 4 doesn't go into 10 equally. That's true, and on the last homework assignment, some of you got a little stuck because I put in a problem in there where I wasn't going to reduce by just one of the numbers given, but a factor of both the numbers. This is going to work the same way. I know 4 won't go into 10 evenly, that's true, but 2 is a factor of both 4 and 10. So I'm going to reduce by 2's, and 2 goes into 4 2 times, where 2 goes into 10 5 times. That's still going to give me smaller numbers, which makes my math easier. Now I multiply across, I end up with 5 times 1, which is 5, 3 times 2, which is 6, so I have 5 6. 5 6 what? 5 6 quarts. Now right below here then they ask you some thinking questions, and some of us are kind of struggling with these questions that are at the very end, like question 12 or question 15, whatever the very last question is, because when it says show or how would I do it and explain, you don't want to explain. That's why we practice these, so we know that we can answer in words what the question is asking us. Describe what you are trying to find in the example above. That's the one with the water. Well, I'm trying to decide how much water each person gets from the amount of water that I have if I have 4 hikers, right? That gets really wordy. If I just change it into a very simple portion, the amount of water each friend needs or each friend gets, that should be an easy sentence. Now on this one, there's 2 parts to it. Explain how dividing mixed numbers is similar to multiplying mixed numbers. How are they different? I have 2 answers here. So when I get done, you might want to pause it to make sure you have it written down. Well, how are they similar? They're similar because we cannot divide or multiply mixed numbers. They both have to be changed into improper fractions, right? So you could say they are similar because they have to be changed into improper fractions. Either way works because I know that you understand what it is that's being asked. How are they different? Well, that really should be kind of easy to understand because they're different because we have to use the reciprocal when I'm dividing. I'm not multiplying, right? If one is multiplication, one is division, multiplying, I just multiply across. But in division, I have to change it into its reciprocal in order to do the math. So now if you didn't get those down, and those are longer sentences, I know it might take you an extra moment to simply pause the video before we work on to building that muscle memory. All right, so once again, we're not estimating, so just ignore the estimating. And I know I'm missing some, boxes and things. I provided extra space because in these problems, there really is a lot more math. I would strongly suggest those of you that struggle with writing in those little itty bitty boxes to get the extra paper because it's going to make your life easier. It's going to be able to be seen easier. It's going to give you bigger spaces. And then when I go to grade it, I can follow along with what you did and give you credit for showing your work. I'm not going to estimate, I'm just going to go straight through and I'm going to do the math every single time. So I have 4 1/3 divided by 3/4. I can use the 3/4, but I can't use the 4 1/3. So every time I'm going to have these mixed numbers, I got to change it to those improper fractions. Starting at the bottom always, first step is always multiplication, second step is always going to be adding. Always going clockwise. So 3 times 4 gives me 12. And then I have 12 plus 1, because that's my last step. That's going to give me a numerator of 13 with a denominator of 3. I can plug that into my math problem. Now, that's something that I can work with. I have 13/3, so I go through my steps. I have to keep my first one. Got to change division into multiplication. And then I got to flip my second fraction. So 3/4 is going to become 4/3. Now I look to see what I can cross reduce. 3 and 4, no, I can't do that. 3 and 13, no, 13 is actually a prime number, so I know it doesn't have any factors. I can't cross reduce, can I? So that means I just have to multiply across and then work with what I'm left with. So when I take my handy dandy calculator and type it in, 13 times 4, I'm going to get 52. And then when I take 3 times 3, I should get 9. Then I have to change it, right? I can't have an improper fraction. Can't be top heavy in my answer, so I know I have to do my division. And my top number has to go inside my box. So 52 divided by 9. 9 goes into 52 5 times evenly. because 5 times 9 is 45, and when I subtract those, I get a remainder of 7. What do I do with the remainder? So yesterday when I was working with somebody, I tried to give that leading statement that I'm always using. My remainder becomes my, and they said 7 or whatever the number was. No. I asked that question because I say it multiple times to get it into your mind so that you should be able to follow along once you hear those words. My remainder becomes my numerator. My divisor becomes my denominator. Now I have my answer that is a mixed number. 5 and 7 ninths. 7 ninths can't be reduced, so I should have the right answer. If I want to check it, if I multiply and add real quickly, well, 9 times 5 is 45 plus 7 is 52. Yeah, I get the same thing that I would have had. All right, so 6 hikers shared 4.5 pounds of trail mix. How much trail mix did each hiker receive? Notice in that story problem, the numbers are in a specific order, but I have to understand that the key to doing these type of problems is knowing the amount that I am going to have to begin with. When I do them, if I have my 4.5 and I have 6, which I can't use, so I put my 6 over 1, which one's going to come first in my math problem? I know that I have 4.5 pounds, and then I'm going to share it with 6 people. So I'm going to take my 4.5, I'm going to make it my improper fraction, and that's going to be my first number. If you look at that story problem, it's switched with the information. They'll try to trick you in any way you can, but if I understand I have to have an amount, or I have to look at what's being used or actually possessed before I divide it into smaller groups, then you'll always set it up correctly. So I take my 4.5, I multiply and add. 2 times 4 is 8 plus 1 is 9, and I keep my denominator of 2. We put 6 over 1, so I know that that's my fraction and I can use that. So I have my 9 over 2, so I know I have to keep my first one. I know I have to change division into multiplication, and I have to flip my second fraction. So my 6 over 1, my 6 whole people, becomes a reciprocal of 1/6. Then I see if I can cross reduce. Well, 1 and 2 can't, that's as low as I can go. But 6 and 9, 3 will go into both of those. So I'm going to cross reduce with 3's. And 3 will go into 6 twice, and 3 will go into 9 3 times. Smaller numbers makes my math work easier. So now I'm going to multiply across. I have 3 times 1, which is 3, and 2 times 2, which is 4, and that's a regular fraction, so I know I've gotten to my answer. 3/4, but 3/4 what? I have 3/4 pounds. Since it's a story problem, I have to remember my label, because I have to remember that's an extra point. I have showing my work, which is a point, my correct answer, which is a point, and my label. So story problems are almost always worth 3 points, unless they ask multiple questions. All right, so 3 and 4, once again, I can't use either of those numbers in multiplication or division, so they both have to be changed. I'm going to take my 3 and I'm going to multiply by my 5, because I start at the bottom and I multiply and then add. 3 times 5 gives me 15, plus my 2 is 17. That's my new numerator. My denominator, it stays the same. So I know I have 17/3 in this first position. My 3, can't use 3 by itself. So I always have to put whole numbers over 1, which will allow me to then work with it when it's time. So I have my first one, so I'm going to keep it. My division, I know has to become multiplication, and then I'm going to flip my second fraction. All right, so now I'm going to stop. I want to pause you for just a moment. Some of you, you know these steps. Some of you have your paper out. Some of you are just going to try writing these down and not have these steps in your mind where you've learned them, nor written down. And how many have we worked where you needed these steps? Almost every problem that you're going to do, there's only going to be 4 problems tonight in your homework that you don't have to have these steps on. So if you're not willing to write them down, you're causing yourself more struggle than you need. Please make sure you write these down somewhere so you have them in your notes if you don't have that original paper that I gave you. Now I'm going to see if I can cross reduce. Well, 17 is actually a prime number if you're not aware, and so therefore 3 won't go into it. 1 and 3 are already, 3 is a prime number and 1 isn't either, but it doesn't reduce anything. It doesn't change my numbers. So that's where I just have to multiply across and use those big numbers that I get. 17 times 1 is 17, and 3 times 3 is 9. It's top heavy, therefore it's improper, and I have to change it. My top number always goes inside my division box, and my 9 is on the outside. Once again, I gave myself more room because I know there's a lot of steps to these problems, so having notebook paper is really handy. My 9 will go into 17 evenly. It only goes in one extra time because 1 times 9 is 9, and when I subtract those, I get an 8. Remember, my remainder becomes my numerator. My divisor is my denominator. So my answer is actually 1 and 8/9. Now I've got the 2 mixed numbers, right? So both of those have to be switched. I have to change 7 1/2 into an improper fraction. I have to change 2 1/2 into an improper fraction. I can't have improper fractions as my answers, but I sure need to use them in my math problems. 2 times 7 is 14, plus 1 is 15, and then I keep my denominator of 2. 2 1/2, then I have to start at the bottom, multiply and add. So I'm going to take 2 times 2 is going to be 4. 4 plus 1 is going to be 5. And then I keep my denominator of 2. So I keep my first one. Division becomes multiplication. My 5 halves, I'm going to have to flip now upside down. I have to use its reciprocal of 2/5. Cross reduce where I can. And instead of getting these big numbers that I have to work with, it does become a lot easier. My 2's automatically, if it's the same in top and bottom, become 1's. They cancel each other out. 5 will go into 5 and 15, so I'm going to reduce by 5, and 5 goes into 5 once, and 5 goes into 15 3 times. Now I'm left with 1's and 3's to multiply, which makes my work a lot easier. So I multiply across. 3 times 3 is 1, or excuse me, 3 times 1 is 3, and 1 times 1 is 1. I can't have it as an improper number, and I know any number over 1 is just that number by itself. So I know that my answer is going to be a 3. All right, so just a couple more. Once again, we're not going to estimate. We're going to look at 5 and 6. Both, or this one on number 5, both of those are starting out as mixed numbers, which I can't use. So I have to change them into improper fractions. So 5 and 3/4. I'm going to start at the bottom. I'm going to multiply and add. 5 times 4 is 20. Plus the 3 is my 23. And then I keep my denominator of 4. 4 1/2. Then I can't use it. So I'm going to take my 4 1/2. 2 times 4 is 8. Plus 1 is 9. Keep my denominator. So when I plug that in, then I go through my steps. I'm going to keep my first one. Division becomes multiplication. Then I flip my second fraction. When I flip my second fraction, I have 2/9. I cross reduce where I can. My 2 and my 4 can both be reduced by 2. 2 goes into 2 once, and 2 goes into 4 twice. But 9 and 23, I can't. 23 is actually a prime number, so nothing's going to go into it. So I'm just going to have to multiply across and deal with what I have. So 23 times 1 is 23, and 2 times 9 is 18. It's an improper fraction. It's top heavy, so I know I have to divide the top by the bottom. 23 divided by 18, and then I know 18 goes in 23 one time. When I subtract those, I have a remainder of 5. My remainder becomes my numerator. My divisor stays my denominator. So I know that my final answer is just 1 and 5/18. All right, so number 6. They give me a whole number, and once again, I can't use whole numbers. So I start by just putting it over 1. And then I got to change my 1 1/3 because I can't have those mixed numbers. So I'm going to have 1 1/3. I'm going to keep my first one of 5 over 1. My division is going to become multiplication, and then I'm going to change 1 1/3 before I continue. So I start at the bottom. 3 times 1 is 3, plus the 1 gives me 4. I keep my denominator. So 1 1/3 is the same as 4/3, and then I know I have to flip my second fraction. So I'm going to multiply it by 3/4. Cross reduce, no, can't do it, can I? So I'm just going to multiply across. 5 times 3 is 15, and 1 times 4 is 4. Top heavy, so I know I have to divide to finish up the problem. 15 goes inside my box. This is once again said 15 divided by 4. 4 goes into 15 3 times because 3 times 4 is 12. But then that does give me my remainder. I have a remainder of 3. My remainder becomes my numerator. My divisor is going to be my denominator. When I have my answer, I look at it. It can't be reduced any more than it is, so I know 3 3/4 is going to be correct. Finishing up with these two then, I have two story problems. This one I'm just going to solve. I don't need you to explain, because we're going to be doing enough explaining tomorrow on our story problems, so we're just going to solve number 10 also. So when I look at it though, it says how many 3 1/3 yard pieces can Amanda get from 13 1/3 yard ribbon? Once again, the key to every story problem when it comes to division is making sure I know the order they have to come in. If it's multiplication, it's easy because they can be in any order. Division can be completely wrong if they're backwards. And these are indeed listed backwards. What do I have? I have 13 1/3 yards ribbon. Then I'm going to break it into 3 1/3 pieces. So I have to start with my 13 1/3 yards because that's what they possess. Going to change it into my improper fraction. 3 times 13, that's a big number, right? 39 plus 1 is going to be 40, and I keep my denominator of 3. So I have 40 thirds divided by 13 1/3. Well, 13 1/3, I'm going to keep that one where it is, and I know I'm going to change division to multiplication, but 3 1/3 I can't use. So I have to change it as well. 3 times 3 is 9. 9 plus 1 is 10. Then I keep my denominator, right? So I know I'm going to have 10 thirds. And if I have 10 thirds, my last step is to flip it. Don't forget that extra step because that's how I get and make sure I have the right answer. So my reciprocal of 10 over 3 is 3 over 10. And then I can cross reduce both ways, can't I? Because 3's cancel out. They're the same number. They both become 1s. They both end with zeros, so I could reduce by 10s, or I could just cross the zeros off. Either way, I'm going to get the same answers. 10 goes into 10 one time, and 10 goes into 40 4 times. Now I'm left with multiplying across. 4 times 1 is 4, and 1 times 1 is 1, and therefore I have 4. But for what? Because I have to have a label. 4 pieces, because it asks how many pieces. Okay. So now on 10, once again, we're just going to solve for it. We're not going to be doing the explaining. It's just building up muscle memory. It says Samantha cut 6 3/4 yards of yarn into 3 equal pieces. She could use mental math to find, or how could she use? Okay, so if I don't want to estimate, which we don't, then I'm just going to solve. And these happen to be listed in the right order, and I know that because she has 6 3/4 yards. So therefore, I'm going to start with my 6 3/4. I'm going to change it into an improper fraction. I'm going to have my 6 3/4. Start at the bottom, multiply and add. 4 times 6 is 24, plus 3 is going to give me 27. I keep my denominator of 4. So I know I have 27 fourths, which I'm going to keep because that's my first step. And I know my division would become multiplication. And then my second fraction, well, gives me a number of 3, right? And I can't use 3 in the problem because it's not a fraction, so I have to put my 3 over 1. Then I can find its reciprocal, which is 1/3. Can I cross reduce? Hopefully you said yes, because 3 does go into 27 equally. I know that because my divisibility rules from the very first lesson of the year, 2 plus 7 is 9, and 3 goes into 9 evenly. So I am going to cross reduce by my 3's. 3 goes into 3 once, and 3 goes into 27 9 times. Multiplying across with what's left. 9 times 1 is 9, and 4 times 1 is 4, and therefore I have to divide to get to my final answer. I'm going to have 9 inside my box. As I said, 9 divided by 4. I'm going to see that 4 goes into 9 2 even times, because 2 times 4 is 8, with a remainder of 1. My remainder becomes, hopefully you thought numerator, and my divisor stays, hopefully you thought denominator. So I have 2 1/4 as my final answer. What's my label? Well, it says yards or yard pieces, right? So 2 1/4 yards or 2 1/4 yard pieces if you want to be specific. All right, so now We're going to look at two more that aren't necessarily dealing with this part of the lesson, and it is going to get a little longer because these need to be explained. Deals with the order of operations. We have to remember the order of operations. Ask for several extra presents from my dear Aunt Sally. I need to know that absolute value, square root, exponents, and parentheses have to be done first. This, once again, is another paper that I've given you, and I've asked you several times to make sure it's in your math folder when you come to my class. I don't have any absolute values, square roots, exponents, or parentheses, but I do then have multiplication and division from left to right. I'm going to start, therefore, with my multiplication. Whatever would come first, if it was switched and this was division first, I'd have to do my division first because these two have to be done in order from left to right. So I know that I have to change my 2 into 2 over 1, and I know I have to change my 1 and 1/2 into an improper fraction, and then I won't be done because I have a second step to it. So there's multiple things that have to be done with these. This is where that extra paper really comes in handy. 1 and 1/2 is going to be changed. 2 times 1 is 2 plus 1 is 3, and I keep my denominator. So I know I have 3 halves. Multiplying by not a whole number of 2, but over 2 over 1. Now, cross reduce where I can. My 2's the same in top and bottom, just simply cancel out and become 1's. Now I'm left with 3 times 1 and 1 times 1, so I just have 3. But I'm not done. So I'm going to keep it in the form of 3 over 1, because that's not my answer. Because now I have my next step. Now I'm dividing by 1 and 1/3. Well, when I have my 1 and 1/3, I have 3 times 1 is 3 plus 1 is 4, right? So I'm going to have my numerator of 4 and keeping my denominator of 3. And then I have to set it up. I have to keep my first one of 3 and 1/3. Division is what it says, but I know I can't divide, so I have to put down multiplication. And then my second one has to be flipped because I have to use its reciprocal. It allows me to then cross reduce because I'm going to have, or no, excuse me, it's then going to allow me to just multiply across because I don't have anything to cross reduce. So now when I multiply across, I end up with 3 times 3, which is 9, and 1 times 4, which is 4. And now I have 9 divided by 4, which gives me the same thing that I had on a previous question, right? Because 4 goes into 9 2 times, which has an 8, remainder of 1, and then I have my new numerator, my denominator. This goes back to 2 and 1/4. Number 12 then has division and addition. So we got to remember how to add our fractions when we get to it, but I know according to my operations, I have to do the division first. So I have to change 1 2/5, change it by multiplying and adding. 5 times 1 is 5, plus my 2 gives me 7, right? So I go to the bottom and I multiply, then I add, that gives me my new numerator, and keep my denominator of 5. So I know this first one is 7 over 5. Those shouldn't have popped up yet, we're not ready for there. Okay. And then on my second one, I have 1 and 13/15. Going to be working with some bigger numbers here. I still do the same setup, even though it's going to be bigger numbers. 15 times 1 is 15, plus 13 is going to give me 28 as my numerator, and then I keep my denominator of 15. Once I have that, then I know my 7/5, I'm going to keep it as my first step. My division would become multiplication, and then my 28/15 has to be flipped because I have to use its reciprocal. Now you should see where those are popping up. I am going to reduce by 5 as it's showing. 5 goes into 5 one time and 5 goes into 15 3 times. Once again, 7, I have 4 equal weeks there, right? Because 7 will go into 28 4 times. So I'm going to reduce by 7s. 7 goes into 7 once and 7 goes into 28 4 times. Then when I multiply across, I end up with 3/4. But I'm not done because I have a second problem listed up there. Adding. Once again, I would suggest that you stack them so you can see better what you're doing, especially when you go through your steps. So I'm going to take my answer that I had of 3/4, and I know I'm adding 5/8, going back to that top of that paper. Can I add fractions? Yes. What do I have to have? Common denominator. Do I have it? No. I have a 4 and an 8. So now I have to change it into, this is where you have two options. You can multiply by opposite denominators. I can take this 4 and multiply top and bottom by 4. I can take this 8 and multiply top and bottom by 8. It's going to give you bigger numbers that you then have to reduce. So I'm going to reduce by, or I'm going to keep my 8, because I know that 4 does go into 8 evenly. That eliminates having to reduce with such big numbers. So that means I have to change this into a denominator of 8. And what do I do to 4 to get 8? I multiply by 2. So I know at the top I want to multiply both top and bottom by 2, so I have that common denominator. I'm keeping the bottom one. The top one has to get a denominator of 8, so 2 times 4 is 8, and 2 times 3 is 6. Now do I have my common denominator? I do. And the form tells me to do what with it? Keep it the same, right? So I'm just going to bring down the 8, and then I do my adding with my numerators, and only my numerators. 6 plus 5 gives me 11, and now I have a top-heavy answer. So I know I have to divide 11 by 8. 8 goes into 11 one time, because 1 times 8 is 8. When I subtract those, I get a remainder of 3. My remainder becomes my numerator. My divisor is my denominator. So I end up with 1 3/8. There's no other steps to do up here, so I know that's my final answer. That's a longer video, I know. That's why I tried to make sure that the first two from this week were quicker on the review and then on lesson 7. So what we're left with now, this should say lesson 9. What we're left with now is some practice problems that you can bring back to me. I left some straightforward division of whole numbers and mixed numbers, but I left one of these multi-steps in case it gets a little confusing to you, as well as the story problem, so we can look and make sure that we know exactly what's being asked of us. If you get it though for lesson 9, then your assignment is going to be here. Make sure you do all of them. Make sure if I assign that last one, you always do that last one. If it says to explain or describe, that you're using words. Some of us are missing 2 points. Those are always worth 2 points because you're putting forth a little extra effort to use your words. If you don't have any questions then, you can work on your assignment. If you do have questions, come back to the room and ask for help.